In this video, I'm going to walk you through the anatomy of composition. We're going to look at 4 different paintings by 2 different artists, 2 figurative paintings and 2 landscape paintings. Really make this clear. So we're going to start right away. Let me share my first painting with you here, and this is Beautiful Portrait by Solomon J. Solomon, and as you can see, a very simple painting. So let me just point out a couple of things here. Certainly, I'm starting here because I'm going to start the conversation with the idea of focus, right? So anatomy of composition, number 1, focus. What is the focus of this painting? And I think that the answer is pretty clear, right? You're not going to say, well, the focus of this painting is this beautiful golden background, right? The focus of the painting is, of course, the portrait, which is a painting of Solomon J. Solomon's wife, actually. So when we're talking about the focus, that's what the painting is about. Now, this can get a little bit tricky. It can get into a little bit of splitting hairs. I understand that. When you're talking about art, there's always play in the joint. But it's helpful to understand the idea of focus because I'm putting it over against the idea of the center of interest, right? So there are painters who say that the center of interest is what the painting is about, right? I'm saying that the focus is what the painting is about. So we have the focus on the portrait here, right? Mrs. Solomon. Henrietta Solomon specifically. The center of interest, I would say, is actually this eye right here. That's the place where I am just drawn again and again, right? I keep coming back here again and again and again. So every interesting thing, that little edge underneath her lip, the edge on the collar, the jewelry, but I still keep coming back to that eye. That eye, though, I think it would be silly if I were to say, well, what's this painting about? And you said, it's a painting of Mrs. Solomon's eye, right? It's a portrait, right? And the center of interest is within that whole focus as a place where your eye can come back to again and again. Really interesting. Those of you who are paying attention have already picked up on the fact that the center of interest is almost dead center, right? How's that working? Well, I think because of the way Solomon has arrange the big light and dark shapes, that's working, right? So taken on a whole, the light shapes of the face are not dead center, even though the center of interest is. So very simple, beautiful, delicate portrait, and first making the case for focus, especially as opposed to center of interest. Now let's talk about Eyeflow. And so Eyeflow, another painting by Solomon J. Solomon, wanted to start with figurative paintings here. Eyeflow starts, I think the best place to start with Eyeflow is the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is, let's see, let me share this with you. Here we go. When you divide the canvas into 3 equal thirds, left to right and top to bottom, you end up with this grid of 9 squares, the rule of thirds. And the idea is that you want to make sure that the primary lines in the piece and also the centers of interest wind up on these thirds, right? And I know that's a little bit of a contradiction from the portrait that we just saw. Of course, I think in that one, it's a very restful, so you're staring at this person. It's just focused on her. It's almost more like an icon, like a religious icon. This is a feeling of action. So notice that the center of interest is right here on this intersection. Samson fighting off the Philistines, or failing to fight off the Philistines in this case. And look at how Solomon J. Solomon has used the rule of thirds to orchestrate this painting. See how these arms and ropes are so close to that upper third, right? Look at, of course, Samson and all this action right on that third line there. But then also the basic light shape of this, right? It comes up on a third and is the lower third is this band across the center, right? So you can see all of that happening, but also something that I think is interesting. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough to take note of. We have Delilah over here with Samson's hair in her hand, and her body is landing on just about a third of this unit in this composition. All of this is to build eyeflow through the piece, right? So, and you can see how beautifully he is using all of these lines to just wrap your eye back and back again into this composition, into the center of interest. Speaking of center of interest, under the idea of eyeflow, the center of interest is definitely here, right? Typically, I would say in most landscape paintings, not all, right, but a lot of them, the center of interest is going to wind up somewhere on the other side. I think that part of telling the story of this drama, right, this is a scene that has no peace in it at all, right? It's all drama, it's all action, and the center of interest is the closest intersection to the viewer's entry point, which is going to be in the upper left-hand corner, right? I think that's because it's that just starting the painting with this explosion of action to really set the pace for just the activity that's happening here. This is not a restful scene. This is not a painting that you're going to meander through and, look at that, the river flowing back and that tree or whatever. I mean, it's a life and death struggle here. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so successful to have that center of interest right there on the first third. But I already mentioned the entry point to you. It is the left-hand side. Look at how he's using this open doorway, which is ever so slightly angled. Look at that. And really creating this little arrow, including these men running in from this side, right? These lines bringing us in to the center of interest, right? So our eye literally starts off the painting rushing in the door into this brawl right here on this third, okay? And lead in, I want to cover this because we're going to look at a landscape painting in a second. It's going to be a completely different mood, but notice how from the bottom edge, he's careful to have these different lines connecting to the bottom of the composition, right? Those are the lead-ins. Those are the paths to reconnect the bottom edge of the painting back into the composition. So you can see how effective each part here is. So we've talked about eyeflow, the rule of thirds, center of interest, the entry point, and the lead-ins. It's all here, right? And now we're going to look at a very different painting and consider it again. This is by artist Arthur Streeton, and of course, a little boy with a flock of sheep in the pasture, right? Completely different vibe and a different setup. Let's go through that idea of the rule of thirds again. I'm just going to draw it for you here. Notice that the whole horizon line is happening pretty close to that upper third. Draw them here. That's going to be about a third, and that's going to be about a third. So we have the main line through the piece on a third. We have where this flock is coming out to meet the pasture or the light, this overlap. Close to that intersection, this tree is just off that right third line as well. So you can see how he's orchestrating this painting according to the rule of thirds. Now let's talk a little bit more about eyeflow. Of course, eyeflow comes from the rule of thirds. You use the rule of thirds to establish eyeflow. Look at how he is taking note of the entry point, right? So if the entry point is the upper left-hand corner, look at how he's using these big sweeping shapes to lead you down into the composition, right? How carefully he laid out those. And then if for some reason you didn't catch that train, look at how he's created this little connection zigzag through into these lines that are leading us down like that. All of those are very artistically placed to guide the eye from the entry point, right? So rule of thirds, but also keeping in mind the entry point to guide the viewer's eye down and in. The lead in, we can see these branches, some different little things here. It's not as strong in this painting as it is in some, but it's certainly still present. So we see it all here, and of course the center of interest is all the way down on the lower right hand, right? Opposite. Samson would be over here. The little boy is over here. And I think it'd just be fun to just toggle back to this one for a second. Let me get rid of that third grid for you. So you can see it, this painting versus this painting, the idea of Eyeflow present in each of those different elements of the anatomy of a composition showing here, but a very different mood, right? A lot more drama, even in the values here, right? A lot more contrast between the darks and the lights, a lot less contrast, a lot more peace and tranquility. Part of that is how he set up the composition, right? So I want to present that to you as, even though I'm presenting it in a very structured sort of way, it really leaves a lot of creativity open, right? You can use these principles to tell whatever story it is you want to tell. Before I leave the subject, I want to talk about balance and symmetry. Balance and symmetry is it's a challenge because you want to make sure that you don't have shapes that clone each other. You want to make sure that you don't have everything the same weight, but you still have to have balance in a painting. And this, again, Arthur Streeton, I think is a good example of balance, because you have in this painting lots of foliage and the center of interest right there, right? That's on the lower left-hand third in this case. The lines in the painting all leading us down to here. We come down to here, we come to these, and we get sort of slingshot back into this composition from there. This, of course, is the lead-in. And the entry point, in this case, is just a big open sky, and the first edge we really can pick up on, they're all down in here. So you can either guide the eye down, like you did here, or you can just leave a wide open plane for your eye to just come barreling down through the viewer's eye to your subject, right? Okay, but what about balance? Balance here is the inclusion of this tree and these details in the lower right-hand corner. The painting, if this had all been blue, and I'm going to paint it for you in just a second so you can see, if he had left all of that blue, just see how unbalanced the painting would have been, right? And so balance is something that you will learn to feel, right? If something feels off, well, maybe, and I'm not sure at what stage he decided that he needed a tree down here and it's just going to paint it back in, you can see that gives balance to this painting. So if you have everything interesting, dark, a lot of really important shapes all clustered on one side, you need to spread that out and add one in one direction or another so that you have these compositional guy wires. You're spreading that interest out just enough so that it doesn't feel like it's all concentrated on one side, that is starting to make your painting left heavy or right heavy, depending. So that is the idea of balance. And that concludes this video of the idea of the anatomy of composition. I hope it's been helpful, and all of this information is in the text below as well.